You're in the right place. This is the Eatfluencer Podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Maggie Landis. Together, we are going to unpack everything about eating and discover the what, when, and how that will let you lead your best life. This is not your doctor's conversation about nutrition. Today is when you can start to love eating again. Let food be food and you be you. Get ready to get Eatfluenced. And welcome back to the Eatfluencer Podcast. I'm Maggie Landis. I'm your host here. So glad you've joined me today. We are going to have a great episode today. This is episode 43, and I titled this Emotional Eating. Let's unpack that baggage. And before I get into that, I have a couple of announcements that I want you all to hear. The first is that my group coaching program, the waitlist is now open. The enrollment for our next group is going to start next Monday, August 2nd. I only open this program a couple of times a year. This is only the third time this year. So I want to make sure that you are the first to know when the enrollment goes live next week. If you are interested in working a little more closely with me to really take the first steps to leave diet culture behind and put some of these concepts we talk about here on the podcast into action, you need to be there. So the link is in the show notes, or you can find it on my Instagram bio, anywhere you find my stuff. The other thing, the announcement I want to make is that if you like this show, by the time we're done here today about emotional eating, I'm having a workshop about emotional eating also next week. It's called Understanding and Overcoming Emotional Eating, and it is going to be live. It is going to be free. I have 2 times that I'm offering it next week, Monday evening and Tuesday midday. There will be a replay, but only if you register. And we are going to go into more detail there than I'm going to do on this podcast, and also go one step further to give you some actionable mindset adjustments and actionable things to incorporate that will keep you from this constant, derailment by emotional eating. I feel like so many women are sort of plagued by this problem of emotional eating, and it is absolutely one of the top things that people mention to me when I say, "Where are you stuck?" This is the answer. So I've got some answers for you. Make sure you check out the show notes if you're interested in that workshop or to get on the group coaching waitlist. But let's get into today's show. So, emotional eating, what is the deal anyway? I mean, we hear this term and we sort of have a visceral response to it, right? This sort of, to me, it's this sort of negative, icky, like we want to reject the idea about emotional eating. It's bad. It means that we're bad. It means that we don't have control, that we, it's not a positive vibe. But actually, it's, what we think is a simple problem that has a really complicated solution that diet culture sells us. It's actually a really complicated problem with a real simple solution. So today we're going to talk about both the problem and just a little bit about the solution. But the good news is it doesn't really matter how complicated the problem is. It doesn't really matter how complicated any problem is, as long as the solution is clear. And so that is the message I hope you walk away with today after listening to this podcast. And this is not going to be, y'all know me well enough, this is not the diet culture version about, quote, controlling yourself and managing your emotions and all this crappy eat substituting activities that they constantly tell us to do to distract us from our emotions. To process this, process is the wrong word, to really fully get into the answer here as to what do we do when we eat because of our emotions. We need to be really honest about what we're doing, what we're thinking, and how we're responding. And does it really all make sense? So it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to process emotions. We're not really good at that, generally speaking. Most people are not, you know, comfortable sitting, particularly with negative emotions, but really any strong emotions. So we are intellectual creatures who like to kind of override the, this whole mess with our intellect. And we have this belief system that as humans, our intelligence is the most supreme, feature we have. And if we get smart enough, I'm doing air quotes, and find just the perfect intervention, then we can fix the problem and it will be gone. But that's not really the case with emotional eating. And we'll get into that a little bit. But, diet culture loves when we're stuck with a problem because that's what they do. The whole premise of diet culture is, offering us solutions for money that cater to where we are stuck, and they sell us an answer. That's how it works. That's how businesses work. That's how good businesses work. And if they do nothing else right and have a complete loss of integrity, diet culture is a good business. So let's talk a little bit about, what is the relationship between emotions and eating, and specifically appetite. This is really fascinating. I did actually review a few studies for you today in preparation for this podcast. I know it seems like I actually did work and really, really impressive, right? But, in most people, emotional stress will elicit a change in appetite. And a lot of times that results in the suppression of appetite or the, not being hungry. And that's specifically true with acute severe stress. And that all pans out with the neurobiology of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which you are, I'm sure, not interested in hearing about. But this is true, right? When you get abrupt, unexpected, severe stress, whether that is news, like emotional news, somebody died, somebody's missing, something like that, whether it's a physical stress, like an injury, like a severe illness, like women in labor, this sort of acute severe stress, you're not really thinking about eating. That's not really in the middle of the stress. That that axis is activated, and that does alter some of the appetite regulation, and our body knows that it needs to preserve whatever energy it's got for dealing with the stress, because in a remote time those stresses were life-threatening. Now, mild to moderate stress, especially on a chronic basis, typically leads to increased food intake, increased appetite. And they call this a atypical response in the literature, but frankly, I don't really think if that's how the body tends to work that there's anything atypical about it. But this tendency to increase your food intake or have an increased appetite in response to mild to moderate negative stress, that's what we have kind of coined as emotional eating. And that's what I think, colloquially we think of when we hear the term emotional eating. We're thinking of using food to cover up negative emotions, and we're eating our feelings. I'm doing air quotes. We're kind of burying our feelings in food. And, that's only part of the story. And it's interesting that it is the most emphasized part of the story, because that's where that's really where the research, like I will tell you that most of the, when I did sort of a quick little search here in a library database, it's most of the research related to emotional eating is related to negative emotions and not positive ones, even though there is also appetite what's dysregulation? Is that a word? Dysregulation with positive emotions too. But diet culture has this fascinating obsession with conclusions that like to blame the players and not blame the game. So it seems way better for them to tell us that our negative emotions that we, quote, can't handle are driving us to overeat and, and therefore become fat, which they believe is unhealthy and all these things. But it's really far less interesting to see how people eat when they have positive emotions or, kind of good things happen, because that also causes a change in appetite. But happy people are not looking for solutions. Happy people don't perceive that they have a problem, and they're not in the market to buy more stuff because they're already happy, right? So it is all about diet culture telling you that everything is framed in this real negative lens, and it's your fault, and something's wrong with you, and they know better, and they have a solution, and they are going to sell it. And it's not a very good sales pitch for people that are happy. So they, prey on people who are struggling with negative emotions and negative stress. And I would also argue that the act of participating in diet culture itself is a chronic negative stress. So ergo propagates this whole cycle, which is quite self-serving to the people that have all the answers, right? So we know that the literature out there is influenced by diet culture and potentially quite biased. And there's really no clean way to completely uncouple our cultural anti-fat phobia, from reality, because the science is influenced under the influence of that message. The participants in these studies are under the influence, the researchers. I mean, there's just lots of complications. And I've talked about this before, but eating and nutrition research is super hard to control anyway, because there's just so much subjectivity, and, you can't, besides, well, I say can't, of course, Ansel Keys figured out how to do it with the starving guys in Minnesota, but, generally speaking, you can't lock people in a room and completely control what they're eating over a long period of time. So the literature is based on a lot of self-reporting and recall, and we know there's lots of bias in that. But the interesting, pervasive, thematic element is this, that the people who struggle with emotional eating are the ones who perceive it to be a problem. Because looking at it as if it were problematic generates the emotions that put you back into the cycle of emotional eating. Okay, that's kind of twisted, right? But what if the eating, the food, has nothing to do with it? That emotional eating, this problem, the way we look at it, is not actually about the food. In fact, it's not about the type of food. It's not about the amount of food. I would even go so far as to argue it's not even really about the person eating the food. What if the problem is this toxic message that we superimpose on the people and the emotions, telling them that they have a problem? So the problem is our own generation of the problem. Okay, this is getting so twisted, I realize that. But this is a great example of how when you make the person the problem, that is a total, boondoggle for diet culture. That is a hotbed, gold mine of opportunity for them to sell the person the solution when the person isn't the problem in the first place. The problem is that we look at it as a problem. All right? Is that clear as mud? Okay, so here's what what's interesting is that, and Christy Harrison, by the way, if you haven't read Christy Harrison's book, Anti-Diet, you need to read it soon. It is, I have a lot of anti-diet and non-diet approach and intuitive eating books that I recommend, but hers is probably the top of the list because she does such an amazing job. She's a dietitian. She's got an MPH, so of course I love her. And she explains with evidence all of these ideas without it being a, reference book. There are references in the book. In fact, there's hundreds of references in the book, but you don't have to be a scientist to read the book. This is written for anybody to read. So anyhow, long story short, you need to read that book. And she explains what I'm trying to say here in a far more clear way with a lot more detail. But this is what the science shows, is that the people who think emotional eating is a problem are the only people for which emotional eating is actually a problem. Okay, totally nuts, right? What it says is that if we could change our mind and our mindset and our perspective on emotional eating, the problem would basically take care of itself. I mean, is that not cool? Like, what if we could actually do that? What if we could fix problems by just believing that it wasn't a problem? I mean, I kind of feel like that might work, but this is really what it pans out in the science. I know it sounds too good to be true, but here's what the science says. So in people who are not chronic dieters, okay, so they're sort of intuitive eaters by default. I mean, whether they, associate with the intuitive eating way of life, if they're not dieting and they're eating based on their own body signals, their hunger cues, their fullness cues, they're essentially intuitive eaters. And they've studied these people, and in response to stress, their appetite diminishes. And the exact opposite happens in chronic dieters. When people are chronically restricting food, chronically dieting, following a bunch of external rules, when they experience a negative stress or a negative emotion, their appetite increases. So there's a totally opposite response in two groups, and the variable is whether or not they diet. So there's a lot of neurobiology and psychology behind this. I'm not going to get in the weeds with that, but essentially they think that chronic dieters have disrupted their appetite regulatory mechanisms from the dieting because they have kind of conditioned their brain, overprogrammed or had an override feature to what's already built in our biology, which was working just fine before diets showed up. But we have, made eating this cerebral cognitive activity. And when you are chronically doing that, it disrupts the appetite regulation because that's the only thing different between those two groups of people. So here's another little, factoid that I dug up in the science that I was reading for this show. People who identify as emotional eaters and people who, and this is of course a self-report because there's not like a blood test for emotional eaters, but people who identify as emotional eaters and people who do not identify as emotional eaters, when they are exposed to stress, assuming that you control for their dieting or not dieting, they eat the same amount. So the emotional eaters don't really eat more than the people who don't classify themselves as emotional eaters. But the difference is that the people who identify as emotional eaters worry about what they're eating and have a stress response and a negative emotional, kind of endpoint in response to the eating. So you can see how that works. They eat the same, but their feelings about what they're eating generate more negative emotion, which then is the stimulus for more eating, which then is the stimulus for more self-blame, more negative emotion. And, I probably don't have to explain this to you because I'm sure you're like, yep. And that's the whole thing with this kind of, I don't want to use the word binge eating problem because binge eating is a very specific description of something. But, this overeating problem that comes when we have our strong emotions, really eating in response to emotions is normal. Judging everything we're doing to generate more negative emotions, that's where the problem is. But of course, as you are well versed in now, this whole concept of emotional eating, when you frame it as a terrible, awful, devastating thing, like disease that we're all dealing with, as a concept, it really, sells because diet culture has you believing that you are the problem, that you are broken. And I hope you're starting to get the idea, even though this is sort of a convoluted way to explain it, that that's not true. You're not broken. Your body is not broken. The thing that's broken is our perspective on eating and food. And it is totally broken. It is totally warped and just in complete shambles as a result of diet culture. So, this really is a short and sweet little episode, but I want you to know a couple of things. Number one, that emotional eating is a super complicated problem, as I've tried to explain in a moderately clear way. But the thing that's clear is the solution. And the solution is to stop dieting, judging ourselves, having all these restrictive rules, and beating ourselves up for not following the rules, because that keeps us in this place where we are captive by diet culture. Your brain works. I tell people all the time, and I've said it on this podcast, the human body is amazing. It is a completely dynamic, perfectly designed biologic system, and it works if we let it just work. But over the course of time, when we try to override all these internal mechanisms, which is essentially what dieting does, is it tells you, no, you can't trust yourself, you can't listen to your body, that's all broken, here's the plan, the app, the points, the calories, the whatever, the tracker, the journal, and listen to us, we know better. And when you get stuck there, well, we know that we have a lot of evidence that that's not a long-term solution, but the override that we have done with our intellect really disrupts on a very primitive biological level these mechanisms that are there for a reason, because they were life preserving for our species thousands of years ago. So the summary, if I had to say it in one sentence, is that, emotional eating is a problem, but it's not the problem we think it is. And it becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger problem when we continue to look at it as a problem. It's really a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you perceive it to be a huge obstruction in your relationship with food, it probably will be, and you will probably stay in this negative headspace, and you will probably continue to look for diets and diet culture solutions because they have you in the palm of their hand. But you don't have to. And if you're interested in learning more about how we don't have to and like what to do, because it's easy for me to say, don't do this. And I say, don't do this a lot. But I know people like something to do and to occupy their headspace and their intellect, because like I said, that's what we do. Please consider going to this, attending my emotional eating workshop next week, because I'm going to do, like I said, a deeper dive and talk about not only just the problem that I've tried to explain here, but some real tactical solutions. And it's not chewing gum and drinking water and journaling and all that diet culture crap that's telling you that you're doing something wrong. So I hope I see you there next week. The link, like I said, is going to be in the show notes. Also in my Instagram bio, you can get right there. DM me anywhere you find me, workshop, and I'll get you the registration form. It is going to be Monday, August 2nd in the evening, and Tuesday, August 3rd at noon. And there is a replay, and there's also going to be some very awesome bonuses I have never released before, that I have never given to my audience before, and you will get those if you come to the masterclass by registering and either come in person or watch the replay. So consider that, and, really just consider whether you want to be stuck in this emotional eating quagmire, because, like I said with the science, it's us thinking it's a problem that is, in fact, the problem. So I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. And remember that there is a new Eatfluencer podcast every Wednesday. Drop me a rating or review on your podcast player, and this will get into the ears of more and more and more women who need to hear it. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for being here today. If you love what you've learned, follow me on social media at Maggie Landis MD, and you'll never miss a thing. You can also check out my website at maggielandismd.com and sign up to be part of our community of eaters. Thanks again for stopping by. We'll talk again soon.